My name's Allison. My name's Allison Hausman, and I'm going to share this evening the program that I developed as part of my doctoral capstone. It's entitled Trauma-Informed Post-Crisis Debriefing Process. And before I get started, I just wanted to give a thank you to Dr. Humbert, my advisor, and all of my friends and family who are here tonight to listen to this and have prayed with me and encouraged me through this whole thing. Thank you so much for getting me through this journey. So in today's presentation, I plan to kind of go through my past several months that I've worked towards the completion of this project. Initially, I was a little all over the place as far as having a bunch of different ideas that weren't really related. But I really found that what I learned in the autism certificate, as well as the trauma-informed care certificate, as well as some really pertinent discussions at my school district, all kind of fell into place around the same time to help me solidify this topic as something that's really needed at my school district where I work. So tonight we're going to start with the literature review and the needs assessment, so you guys can kind of see why this topic was important and timely for my place of work. Then we're going to talk a little bit about the program that I developed, as well as staff responses to the initial training from that program. And lastly, we're going to discuss where I plan to go from here with regards to this program. So we're going to get started with the literature review, which is my review of the research. Research really does show that following the pandemic specifically, there's been a decrease in children's ability to self-regulate, leading to an increase in negative behavior in the classrooms, and we're seeing an increase in unsafe behavior in the schools. I had suspected and then was later able to confirm in the research that there is an increase in behavior and that this does impact all students' occupational performance in the classroom, not just the student who is having that negative behavior. My research really initially started focusing on physical restraints and removing students from the classroom or a form of seclusion. We typically avoid those things, but sometimes due to safety concerns, those are needed. And I had been really bothered by the rise, it seemed to be, in the intensity and restrictiveness of our behavior interventions that were needed, and then the lack of follow-up and just preventative care that we had, especially for my students with cognitive disabilities. So that's what kind of took me to the research and started on this topic. All the research notes, which makes sense, that the relationship between the restrainer and the person being restrained is really damaged following that event. And with research supporting that supportive adult relationships are a key resilience factor for students, the need for some kind of restoration or debriefing process just really became evident to me. We needed an effective way to rebuild relationships and restore classroom participation to support the educational performance of all of our students that were involved. Otherwise, the students were undergoing another traumatic experience, but then we're also losing that key protective factor of the supportive adult. And that lack of resilience, I felt like, could really lead to cyclical or recurring behaviors that would then negatively impact the student, not only the student, but also their teacher and everyone else in their classroom. And many studies I found in my research did show that some kind of formal debriefing really does reduce the chance of recurring behaviors. So that was really important as well. So in analyzing all of the research as the literature review, I began to really think about the potential impacts expanding even further beyond just the person who was in crisis or pre-crisis behavior, and began to generalize that knowledge to less severe behavioral incidences. And I was curious about how that impacted the other students in the classroom. I really thought that similar principles would probably apply, but I wasn't really able to find any studies on how to mitigate prolonged risks for everyone that was involved, or really any research on differing levels of behavior that weren't quite as severe. I did, however, read a lot of research that showed that people with autism or intellectual disabilities are actually at much higher risk for high-level behaviors, which made sense to me because that's what I was seeing in my workplace. Everything was kind of pointing to the benefits of a formal debriefing process, and our district didn't really have one of those. So the program that we are currently using has behavior management strategies, and it's helpful in that regard, but it doesn't really address people with autism or intellectual disabilities. And since that population does tend to have delays or limitations in skills like executive functioning, emotional regulation, which I also found in the research are really key protective and resiliency factors, I felt like a similar debriefing support should be provided not only for our general education students, but also for our students in the special education demographic. So in the end, I really saw a need that I felt like school-based OTs could really help to fill. I used my distinct value and skills as an occupational therapist, paired with the education that I received in the trauma-informed care certificate, as well as the interdisciplinary autism certificate at eTown. And I created a trauma-informed program for post-crisis debriefing to try to really help with that smooth return to optimal occupational performance in the classroom following any kind of behavioral incident. The program was created with accessibility in mind as well, so that all staff and students, including anyone with a cognitive, sensory, or communication difference, could really access it. So to determine the specific needs for my district, I completed a needs assessment last summer. And firstly, I collected behavioral incident data from my district. So in looking through all of the discipline referrals in our system over the past 3 years, I saw a steady trend around 2,100 reports each year. And when looking at what those referrals were for, there's some things like tardiness, chewing gum, less severe behavioral incidences. But about 25 to 30 of those reported incidents involve some kind of safety concern. So that would be something like physical aggression, assault on a staff or a student, fighting, threats, harassment, things like that. And about 600 referrals per year involved something that was considered or could escalate to a crisis level behavior. So while our general incidents kind of remained at that higher level, I found some really good news that physical restraints were actually trending down. So staff were less hands-on with students, which was really good to hear. However, I did note that the number of students involved in a restraint was always lower than the number of restraints reported, which shows that some students are repeat offenders or students who have a recurring high-level behavior. And I wondered if this might be due to our lack of debriefing procedures. I also did notice that about 80 to 94% of the physical restraints that were reported each year were with students who had autism or intellectual disabilities as a disability category on their IEP. So I thought that was really interesting. In a review of our current programming, our school district uses CPI right now. There was little to no information provided regarding debriefing with students with disabilities. And I also noticed that there was no information about debriefing with peers or addressing peers, as well as nothing about the adults or adult self-care or strategies to buffer secondary trauma or stress of the adults, which I had found in the research was really important to address when considering regulation. Our CPI trainers, our CPI trainers had already done a really good job gathering staff feedback. And so I kind of piggybacked off what they were already doing to get staff perspectives regarding our current behavior management trainings. And staff immediately and consistently identified that there is really a lack of what they were calling a follow-up procedure after a behavioral incident in their classroom. So a lot of staff were identifying that that's a lack of consistency between staff members. And then I noticed in talking with district-wide staff that there's not a lot of consistency between our buildings either. A lot of teachers were reporting feeling left out of that follow-up process, being uninformed about who was following up about what and when and how. And they felt unsupported in their ability to reestablish relationships with their students. They noticed a big need for additional time and support to be able to utilize opportunities to debrief. They felt like clearer communication and instructions would be helpful, and they wanted time allotted to be able to maintain their contractual right to lunch and planning as well to be able to complete all of these things. So then lastly, I met with the district over the summer to discuss the district's priorities. They had already expressed that they were really interested in the program, which was amazing. They were very supportive of restructuring or at least adding a structure to our current debriefing and behavior management resources. And the administration really expressed their desire to start requiring debriefing for staff by providing coverage to their classrooms. They were discussing ways and feasibility options for adding full team debriefing meetings after these types of things. They also noted time as the primary barrier that was consistent between the two groups. And overall, the district would really like to see resources for other students in the classroom who experience these types of higher level behaviors. And they thought that a simple checklist format, as compared to the kind of like find your own resources or make your own think sheet that we've been using currently, I felt like a checklist would be a really good format and most useful for staff. So given all of that information, I began to create a 3-part program to start to address all of those needs that we just discussed. And since adults really do need to be regulated first and foremost to support the students, both as a preventative strategy, but then also as a prerequisite to any kind of attempt to co-regulate with the student, I decided to start my program with a section specifically related to adult regulation, as well as co-regulation strategies. This was the topic of a preliminary training that I'll discuss later. The second part of the program then was to be used by staff following a behavioral incident in their classroom. So it's a checklist format like we just talked about that staff can use with scaffolds for students with communication, sensory, and cognitive differences. And then part 3 has a very similar format, but that is a process for the whole classroom to debrief. And each of those 2 sections comes with a 1-page checklist format, kind of a to-do list for the teacher, as well as an additional toolbox with additional resources for staff to gain more information and additional resources at their own convenience. I really wanted to do all of the digging and researching to find really what was best practice and the most evidence-based tools that were out there, kind of disseminate them down and condense them into something that was easy for staff to access, understand, and then adapt based on their students' needs. Sorry. Okay, with the overarching view of having just a general post-intervention debriefing process to prevent future behavioral incidences, each part of the program really addresses some of those needs that I identified. So the first one was to reduce the number of behaviors in general, and this program overall addresses that need, as the research indicates that having some kind of formal debriefing procedure reduces the number of recurring events. This comprehensive program addresses that need. The need for resources to address trauma and autism and intellectual disabilities is also addressed in each part of the program. Specifically in parts 1 and 2. In part 1, the training part specifically, staff were provided with resources regarding trauma and trauma-informed care. And then in part 2, the scaffolds that are included for different neurotypes, cognition, and communication styles kind of address that need. And then lastly, the need to increase staff comfort level and effectiveness with debriefing. Following part 1 of the training, which we'll go into depth here in a minute, staff were surveyed and they indicated that their confidence of implementing part 1 of the program, which is what they were trained on, was actually very high. The majority of them rated their comfort level at 8 or above, which was really good to see. So while the need to discuss and train on specific needs for students with disabilities regarding self-regulation and things like that was a really high priority that I found in the literature, when I communicated with my school district, we kind of I don't want to say change priorities, but we really did decide that we needed to start training with part 1 first. So adult regulation is equally applicable to all staff. It's really the starting point for all the subsequent debriefing. So as I mentioned, I created and then gave a 50-minute professional development training, which is on the first part of the program, and 80 staff members voluntarily attended that training. So without going into a ton of detail on what we discussed during that training, first we just kind of started with an overview of the 3 parts of the program. Then we discussed basic information regarding trauma-informed care, including, what definitions for the words we were going to be using. And then we did an interactive activity where staff could identify symptoms of burnout and secondary traumatic stress, which I feel like really helped them understand and have buy-in for the need of this type of a program in our school. We also discussed co-regulation versus coercive regulation and how staff could tweak some of their current behavior management strategies to better align with trauma-informed care and co-regulation. In our discussion about adult regulation specifically, we talked about nervous system pathways and being able to identify where you are in those 3 pathways. We were able to focus on 3 actionable steps that are covered in part 1 of the program. And then we were also able to have opportunities to practice some of those strategies throughout the presentation. After that 50-minute training, staff were able to ask questions, provide verbal feedback, and then I also gave a digital survey for staff so that I could use that feedback in revisions to the program in the training. Staff who attended this preliminary training were really just the beginning of conversations surrounding the importance of trauma-informed care and the reasoning behind developing a more formal debriefing process at our school. I will briefly review the feedback that we provided or that they provided in their survey responses, and hopefully you'll be able to see, at least to me, it appears like the training really increased staff self-awareness and also helped them have good buy-in regarding the need for such a procedure at our school. So these initial results here show that the majority of participants, about 52 of the 76 that responded, rated their understanding of trauma-informed care following the training at an 8 out of 10 or above, and 90% rated it at a 7 or above. About 51 of the 76 respondents felt confident enough to rate their ability to implement the program components reviewed in the training at an 8 out of 10 or higher. And an even larger number, about 83% of the participants rated it at a 7. And that was just after the 50-minute training. The general feedback that we got on the benefit of the training was also really positive. The largest number of respondents, 33, rated the benefit of the training at a 10 out of 10. Only one respondent rated it less than 5, and the average benefit rating that was given between all 76 respondents was an 8.9 out of 10. A higher number of respondents, about 86%, rated their likelihood to use components of the training and program in their current work an 8 out of 10. So I think this shows that staff are really interested in utilizing the resources that they obtained in just part 1 of the training and a preview of the other parts. And then lastly, when they were asked about the program's potential impact on improving self-regulation for both staff and students in their classroom, the large majority of participants, 92% of people, responded that they expect the benefit to be at an 8 out of 10 or above. So given that very few staff members currently debrief with their students, even if they have a physical restraint level intervention in their classroom, I think it was clear that a more comprehensive trauma-informed approach was really needed district-wide. And I believe that it will be likely well received based on the feedback that I got that we just reviewed from that initial training. But that being said, the district is currently several steps away from the ultimate goal, which would be to have my program used with fidelity, district-wide, kind of mandated as a procedure to use across all buildings. But I'm really excited to say that in the new year, now that the program has been fully developed, it's kind of awaiting that formal district approval process right now. But then once the district begins to promote that program and offer it district-wide to all staff, staff will have access to it on our staff portal, which is a really easy way to update things and keep things accessible for everybody. We'll use Google Drive, so edits will be easy. But staff will have access to the full program, which includes all 3 of those checklists, as well as the toolboxes for each section to gain additional information. And then I think while the initial training was really beneficial and well received, I just did really want to mention that to have like a thorough and effective implementation of this program, one that's like this large, it can't really happen immediately. So that was something that me and my advisor had to talk about a lot through this process. I tend to be like a go big or go home kind of mentality person and wanted to roll out the whole thing like right away. But I think I understand a lot better now the cultural shift that kind of needs to be made, and to be able to implement something effectively, it needs to be done with consistent incremental efforts over a long period of time. So the training that I just described is just kind of one of those first steps in that direction. In the future, I have a lot of ideas for additional training. I really hope initially that staff would be able to complete the previously mentioned training. Like all staff would be able to complete that. I also would love to create similar trainings for all parts of the program, kind of in a similar format, since that was pretty well received. I think maybe rolling that out on a smaller scale with more specific groups of teachers, like I'm thinking our emotional support teachers or autistic support teachers, who might have to use this program more regularly, would be really helpful. And I'd also love to collect their feedback, similarly to how I did with the people who took the initial training, just to make sure that there's good buy-in, it's also feasible and appropriate for their classrooms, because I kind of had them in mind when I created it. I also think that as occupational therapists, we know that through occupation and doing is kind of how we learn best. So I think additional practice opportunities are really needed for some of the skills and strategies that are noted in the program. So I think continuing along those lines of additional training having a more robust training program regarding those scaffolds that are already in existence as like variations of those would be really helpful, as well as specific training on students with autism and intellectual disabilities. I just think the higher prevalence and the intensity of behavior with those diagnoses, paired with their unique communication needs, their sensory differences, and potential cognitive differences, I think addressing all of those things and a more specific training in the future would be really helpful as well. But right now, the district only offers student services professional development training once per year in October. So that's when I gave the initial training. So I think we're going to need to explore other opportunities. I have a couple options for faculty meeting trainings and things like that, just to be able to kind of offer as much training as I think would be necessary for this to be rolled out well. So as you can see, given the short length of the OTD program, the full extent of my program has not really been implemented yet. However, I really do look forward to mapping out the next few months and even years, as we're really looking to kind of comprehensively shift the way that our staff debrief with students following some of those intense classroom behaviors. I'm also excited to see just the positive changes overall that we see school-wide, as I work to continue to expand the role of school-based OT in this area. I'm just really excited about that. So thank you so much for your time. I'd be happy to answer any questions if anybody has any.
You are more than welcome to put questions in the chat box, and I'm happy to moderate that, or you're welcome to unmute yourself and ask.
I have a question, and I might have missed it, but how big is the district that you're in?
Yeah, so we have about 3,000 students, or actually staff or students.
Staff.
Oh, staff, sorry. There's between 300 and 400 staff.
Okay. So the staff that participated, and again, I might have missed this, but where did they fall in the
Yeah, good
roles?
question. Yeah, so a variety. We offer the student service training for paraprofessionals through administrators, district-wide. So it's people they have like a whole list and they choose different sessions they'd like to attend. So the 80 people that attended, there was some support staff members, there was staff from every building, there was teachers, school counselors, speech therapists, administrators, social workers, nurses. Like we had like almost every role. I was actually surprised, kind of by the number of people that signed up and the variety of people that signed up. So unfortunately, I did notice that there was only 2 staff members from autistic support or emotional support that attended. And those were kind of who I thought might be most kind of, might benefit most from the program. But I think because the training was on adult regulation in that first part, I think everybody kind of felt like that, relates well to them. And that's kind of why the district did want to start with that portion as well. So, yeah, to answer your question, it was a variety of staff members that attended, not really like a specific trend for where they fell. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. And thank you for what you're doing is great work and very much needed.
Thank you.
You're getting lots of great jobs and great work, and lots of comments about folks saying that this is something valuable that other districts can use as well.
Oh, yeah. I think
Any
so.
other questions?
I have a question.
Yeah.
So, first of all, Allison, congratulations. Again, did a beautiful job. My question is, and I don't know that we've ever discussed this in our meetings, but do you know of any other districts locally or in central Pennsylvania that offer the debriefing post-crisis?
So not really. I know a lot of districts use CPI, like that's the program that we currently use. So I do know that that's common, like in our area. And there is brief sections in there about debriefing. It's just kind of like a list of questions. It's not very like comprehensive, and so I think that's what most districts are using. I am not aware of anyone who has like a more formal or scaffolded program. There were some people in our cohort that I even asked to who kind of were interested in this topic and don't live in my state, but I was asking kind of around there too. And I think there's a lot of people looking to have OT kind of involved in helping adapt kind of what's used, but I don't think there's currently anyone, at least locally, who has something similar. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm.
Anyone else? Well, hearing no further, I would say congratulations, Allison, Dr. Hausman, and
Ew.
with your recording will be available soon. Thank you so much. You did a fantastic job.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.